So our next talk is with Stephan Schwartz. It's intention as a variable in non-local consciousness research. Really interesting title, Stephan. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say tonight. Thank you for
Oh,
joining us.
okay. Well, let me get started. I need to say from the beginning that I'm an experimentalist. What I know is based entirely on objectively verifiable data. I'm not a theoretician. I'm not a philosopher. What shapes my thinking is impeccably conducted research. And precisely for those reasons, I cannot answer what I think are the two most important questions in non-local consciousness research. What is consciousness and what is information? And I do not know what consciousness is, nor do I know what information is. And as far as I can tell, neither does anyone else, at least not in a fact-based way. But what I can discuss with some certitude is how consciousness operates and how certain variables can be manipulated in the development of your research protocols that will improve the ability to access non-local consciousness and increase the quality of what you do get. The experimental data, I think, has given us three variables we can manipulate and therefore improve the linkage: numinosity, entropic process, and the intensity of emotion as a factor of intention. There's nothing abstract about this. It's not speculative hand waving. All three would require not a paper, but a book. So in this instance, this presentation, I'm going to focus on intention. Holding intention is like choosing search terms and doing a Google search. It creates a non-local information linkage. No, I have no idea what the elements of the process are, but I do know from experimental evidence that it is outside of space-time and neither distance nor time attenuates it. The key to accessing the non-local based on the research is the ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness. That's why meditators routinely do better than non-meditators. Doing this places the normally overwhelming flood of sensorial stimulus and mentation that it creates. I'm cold, I'm hot, boy, these ribs were great for dinner. Why doesn't that person shut up, into the background and allows one to open to the non-local aspect of consciousness. Always present, but mostly submerged in the sensorium that dominates what we call thinking most of the time. That's why, as I say, meditators routinely do better at non-local tasks than non-meditators. Meditators have developed the discipline of quieting themselves and opening to the non-local aspect of consciousness. Holding intention, experiments show, can also change both the physical reality as well as the subjective aesthetic reality of an object, person, or place. The data shows the effect can be manifested both locally and non-locally, which suggests it is fundamentally a non-local alteration of the intention target's information architecture. So I want to talk about the research that got me to thinking this way. So here are some examples. I'll start with one of my own: intention in studies and its demonstration of a physical manifestation. This was a water experiment where we had water specially created out of gases so that it was ultra pure and placed in little hermetically sealed glass bottles. And these bottles were taped to the hands of healers who were doing healing, everything from evangelical Christianity to channeling space people. And they did so for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes with a different bottle: 5-minute bottle, 10-minute bottle, 15-minute bottle. Study presented 14 cases involving 14 practitioners and 14 recipients. The first hypothesis, that the variation in the spectra of all, that is, that we predicted that using infrared spectrophotometry, multiple internal reflection, that there would be a change, a predictable change in the bonding relationship of the water. And in fact, treated spectra compared with the control samples, and there were two kinds of controls: one in the room, which to study the idea of how spaces become spiritual spaces, or perceived as spiritual spaces, and a second control in another building. And so the hypothesis that there would be a change was confirmed. P equals 0.02, 10%, 15 of the spectra were done using germanium, and 90% of the spectra were done using zinc selenide, which turns out to be the better way to go if anybody wants to do this experiment again. The zinc selenide internal reflection yielded a P of 0.005. And overall, the treateds versus the controls equaled P equals 0.00004. The second hypothesis, that there existed a relationship between the time of the exposure of the water to the healing intention, did not confirm. So whatever it is that's happening, it doesn't matter how long, the change of time doesn't seem to make any difference. Then I want to look at, beginning in 1994, an independent Japanese researcher, Masaru Emoto, who's known to most of you, had the idea to freeze double distilled water and then freeze snow crystals from the water and observe it through a microscope as the snow crystals formed. Emoto's general idea was to see if various stimuli to which the water was exposed would change people's aesthetic experience of snow crystals made from the water. So he showed alphabet letters to the water. He showed pictures. He played music to the water. He then froze the water and had people look at the snow crystals, comparing their aesthetic experience of the treated water with the identical water that was not the focus of intentioned awareness, and he saw differences. He also directly addressed the question as to whether intentioned focused awareness using a ritual of prayer caused a change, and once again found that it did. The water upon which intention was focused produced crystals that were judged to be more aesthetically appealing when compared to the snow crystals. This research, however, was controversial until Dean Radin, known to everybody, picked it up and decided to see if he could improve the problem of the protocol and what caused the criticism. And he, in fact, redid the experiment. His hypothesis was that the water treated with intention can affect ice crystals formed from that water. And a group of approximately 2,000 people in Tokyo focused positive intention toward water samples located in an electromagnetically shielded room in Petaluma, California. The group was unaware that similar water samples set aside in a different location as controls were set aside as controls. Ice crystals formed from both sets of water samples were blindly identified, photographed by an analyst, and the resulting images were blindly assessed for aesthetic appeal by 100 independent judges. Results indicated that the crystals from the treated water were given higher scores for aesthetic appeal than those from the control water, P equals 0.001, one-tailed, leading support to the hypothesis. These are physical changes that resulted in non-local perturbation. But in an experiment that follows that I want to go into, one of mine, we see a commensurate aesthetic effect. In this case, the protocol was a series of 12 experiments to assess whether there was some aesthetic difference between wine treated by intentioned awareness and control wine, physically identical but unexposed to intentioned awareness. 3 party giver hosts, blind to the existence of the others, were asked if they would conduct a taste test for me. I told them that I was buying a large quantity of wine. I didn't mention anything about the intention focus. I said that I had gotten this selection of wines down to 2 wines, and would they give a party and have 7 tasters come and assess the wines. That's 84 unpaid volunteers, 7 at a time, both genders. The intender group was comprised of 93 individuals, all belonging to some kind of metaphysical study group that was interested in non-local consciousness. And basically what I would do would bring them a bottle of wine, 750 milliliters, into two 350 milliliter bottles, and tell them that these were two different wines. They were in fact the same wine, and then ask them to focus on it, and then tell me which of the two wines were the better wine. And in 11 of the 12 cases, p equals 0.00049, the tasters chose the treated wines as opposed to the control wines. And so, of course, this experiment doesn't prove that focused intention can alter the subjective aesthetic perception of a substance, but this experiment by itself. But this experiment isn't actually by itself. In 2007, Dean Radin led a team that did something similar to the wine study, in which chocolate was the focus of the intention, and they described their protocol. It's easy to see the parallels. Individuals were assigned to one of four groups and asked to record their mood each day for a week by using the profile of mood states. For days 3 and 4 and 5, each person consumed a half an ounce of dark chocolate twice a day at prescribed times. 3 groups blindly received the chocolate that had been in the focus of intentioned awareness by a group of monks, and were treated by 3 different techniques. The intention in each case was that the people who ate the chocolate would experience an enhanced sense of energy, vigor, and well-being. The 4th group blindly received untreated chocolate as a kind of placebo control. The hypothesis was that the mood reported during the 3 days of eating chocolate would improve more in the intention groups than in the control groups, and the results closely align with that. On the 3rd day of eating the chocolate, mood had improved significantly in the intention conditions as compared to the control conditions, p equals 0.04. Analysis in a planned subset of individuals who habitually consumed less than the grand mean of 3.2 ounces of chocolate per week showed a stronger improvement in mood, p equals 0.0001, and increased vigor, p equals 0.002, declining fatigue. 6 years later, Yongjung Shai, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, at the National Keohaisong Normal University in Taiwan, assisted by Radin, carried out another study paralleling the wine study. In this case, they had oolong tea that they drank in the morning and in the afternoon, and one randomly group received tea that had been intentionally treated by 3 Buddhist monks. The other group blindly received untreated tea from the same source. On the last day of the test, each person indicated what type of tea he or she believed he had been drinking. Once again, the change was subjective aesthetic judgment. I think this is very important, not a physical change, but an aesthetic change. And how did that come out? Those who drank treated tea showed a greater increase in mood than those who drank untreated tea. Change in mood in those that believed they were drinking treated tea was much better than those who did not. P equals 0.00002, two-tailed. So we now have 2 bodies of research. One is described here, the ability of intention-focused awareness to produce a non-local perturbation effect on the water. That's the water studies, which showed a change in the molecular structure of the water, and also a series of studies that look at the control by aesthetic judgment. So if we go on, I can only touch a little bit of this research. It's clear that it works both ways. In 1968, research physician Jean Barry at the Institut Métaphysique carried out an experiment using violet tooth fungus cultures which had been cultivated under optimal conditions, 10 petri dishes with the culture for each participant, in all a total of 195 dishes. Of that total, 151 of the cultures in the dishes that were the focus of negative intention showed inhibited growth. There were 10 participants, each of whom carried out 9 sessions expressing therapeutic intention. And as I said, the task was to inhibit the growth of fungus cultures. And to do this, they concentrated for 15 minutes from a distance of about 4 feet away, never touching the cultures. Of 194 dishes. As I said, 151 showed retarded growth. So this process of intention not only seems to have the ability to change physical structure, but also the way something is perceived. And I think that's a very important point. Perhaps because of that, although I've never been tested in humans, you can see how the religious idea of hexes and evil eyes that has developed in many cultures across millennia may in fact be a result of this kind of therapeutic intention. Let me see how much time I have here, because I have way more research than I have time for.
You have about 10 minutes at least.
10 minutes? Okay, well, let me
At
keep
least.
going. All right. Well, let me turn to things that are even more strange, you would think, and that is, can you literally change the way a word or the writing of a word can make a difference by focusing therapeutic intention or intention perturbation? I want to present, there are 8 experiments that have been carried out dealing with this at different times by different researchers. 5 of them involved a prediction of improved memory, 1 involved improved confidence, and 1 involved a greater sense of spirit for real versus fake words. They all focused on a model of consciousness that was originally reported by British biologist Rupert Sheldrake, who called it morphic resonance. The first test involves memorization of a nursery rhyme in Japanese by non-Japanese speakers. 1 is a real nursery rhyme, 1 was a real nursery rhyme, 2 were meaningless collections of Japanese words. Then the participants in the UK and the USA were asked which they could remember better, predicting that the real nursery rhyme would be easier to remember than the fake one, and that in fact turned out to be true and highly significant according to Sheldrake. The second test was reported by Gary Schwartz, who was then at Yale, a Yale professor of psychology, now at the University of Arizona. And Schwartz used, no kin by the way, Schwartz used 48 3-letter Hebrew words from the Old Testament, of which 24 were common words and 24 were rare words. That is, they weren't used very frequently. For each of those words, he produced a meaningless anagram by scrambling the letters, thus producing a total of 96 words. Participants who did not know Hebrew were shown the words one by one and asked to guess their meaning by writing down the first English word that came to mind. They were also asked to estimate their confidence in their guess. He found on average that the group of 90 participants were significantly more confident about their guesses when viewing real words than scrambled words, even though they did not know that some of the words were real and some of them were false. A third test was reported by Alan Pickering, a psychologist specializing in cognitive psychology. He was a lecturer at Hatfield Polytech, now the University of Herefordshire in England. And like Gary Schwartz's experiment, Pickering used real and scrambled words. In this study, they were drawn in Persian script. Participants were shown a word for 10 seconds, then asked to draw it. Independent judges were evaluated the reproductions without knowing which words were real and which words were scrambled. The judges assessed that the real words were reproduced significantly more accurately than the false words, and this finding was later successfully repeated in student projects using Persian and Arabic words. The fourth study was carried out by Arden Malberg, an American psychologist at the Integral Psychology Center. Malberg took a different tack. Instead of language, what he did was create Morse code, real Morse code words and fake Morse code words. Everybody, you don't hear much about Morse code anymore, but it's dit-da, little dits, little dots and dashes. And he created both real words and fake words. And the protocol was comparison of the ability to learn the fake and the genuine words. And on average, participants learned the real Morse code significantly more accurately and quicker than they learned the fake code. Fifth and sixth studies were carried out by German psychology professor Sweetbert Ertl, University of Göttingen. Ertl tested recognition of hiragana, a phonetic form of Japanese writing, and predicted that these characters would be recognized better when they were right side up than when they were upside down. And that would conform with the Sheldrake's idea of this morphic resonance. And what he found in the experiments was that the real characters were remembered better than the fake. Ertl then ran additional complex tests, which resulted in ambiguous outcomes. So I could go on and on. There are a number of these studies, but the takeaway from all of this research is that intentioned awareness has the capacity to produce in an objectively measurable way both physical changes, changes in the water structure, for instance, or aesthetic changes, or comprehension changes, or memory changes. So clearly, when we are designing experiments that involve non-local consciousness, we want to use people who have the ability to attain and sustain intentioned focused awareness, so that that group of people is more capable of attaining and sustaining intentioned awareness than non-meditators. And that when we do this and we use these people, we are likely to get better research outcomes. And I think that's all my time, and thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was it was really, I really enjoy the way that you're able to take this whole myriad of different studies and bring it all together for a thesis like this. I think it's a really wonderful ability that you have, and it's just been very enjoyable listening to you. There were a few questions. If anybody else has questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. I was wondering if you could talk a little, you're talking about intention-focused awareness. I was wondering how you might define that as different than just focus. For example, we talk about numinous targets oftentimes when we're talking about trying to get targets that are going to get people's attention, and they tend to have focus, whether it's good or bad or whatever the intention might be. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference between what you're talking about in that.
Well, what you're describing is numinosity. Numinosity was a term coined in the late 19th century, but the interpretation of it that most people use today is from Carl Jung. Jung said, and this is a quote, "Noumena," by which I think he means information, "are psychic entia. They exist outside of space and time." So he is addressing what I believe is correct, and that is that non-local consciousness is a series of architectures of information and acts of information. And for instance, in remote viewing, we know from the research that it is easier for a remote viewer to see Chartres Cathedral than it is a French warehouse of the same physical size. Now, why is that? And the answer, I think, is that from the moment it was conceived of, Chartres Cathedral has been the focus of intentioned, emotionally charged consciousness. I mean, it's millions of people over the centuries have contributed to this. So it is highly numinous in Jung's terms, whereas nobody pays any attention to warehouses. And so when you construct, for instance, a remote viewing target pool, you want to be sure that you're not putting in targets that are highly numinous and trying to match them up against targets that are not, because what will happen is you will get, and that's exactly what we observe, you will get displacement. Now, the same thing is true of entropy. I didn't get into that because I only have a limited amount of time. But for instance, if you show remote viewers a picture of, or the target, let's put it that way, and these are all triple blind, by the way, experiments. That is, John, I'm going to show you a target in an hour. Would you please describe it for me? Now, at the time that I'm asking you and that you're giving me answers, there is no target, at least not one that's been selected, because that happens after I have collected your data, and it's done by random number generators. So if you have two aircraft carriers, one of which is nuclear powered and one of which is petroleum powered, we know from the research that the nuclear powered carrier will be more easily seen by the remote viewers than the petroleum one. Why is that? Because when you go back and look at the data, what is catching their attention is the entropic process of the nuclear activity. They say things like, well, this is a great big metal box, huge, and inside of it is a little star, or there's a little sun inside, or there's something incredibly hot and dangerous that is the source of the power. And whereas you don't see that, because everybody's used to seeing diesel powered engines, but we don't get close to nuclear powered reactors very often. So we know from the research that the remote viewing research that numinosity, that is increased numbers of individual acts of intentioned awareness, heighten this numinosity because they are informational enrichers. Things which have higher entropic process are also easier to see. Ed May did a very interesting experiment involving liquid nitrogen. And when we work with people who are able to hold intention, and by what I mean by intentioned awareness is not only that you are reaching a state of single-minded focus, but also that you're doing so with an intention, because the intention is like a Google search term. You know, you go into Google and you search John Kruth, and that's your intention, and that's what comes up on the website, all those citations of you. Whereas if you were just holding an intentioned consciousness, a single-minded consciousness, but with no intention, and that's why meditation is taught in martial art dojos in Japan, or Tibetan monasteries, or Buddhist temples, or Catholic seminaries. That's why meditation is such a strongly correlated aspect of religion. When you strip away the dogma, and I'm going to say a lot more about this tomorrow, but you know, when you strip away the dogmas and the scriptures and all that, and you just deal with these as empirically developed sciences, you see that people have understood for a long time that the key to opening to non-local consciousness is the ability to hold focused intention.
Well, thank you. And I know if you do a Google search with my name, you're actually going to get a folk musician from Milwaukee, but that's all right. We share that together.
You're double life.
Stephen, you're bringing so many questions to my mind, but I have to put my questions aside because there's other questions that have come up. And one of them was related to whether you talked about this study where people were trying to retard the cell growth from a distance and how effective that was. Could people also cause harm or injury to a person with this type of focused attention?
Yes, that's
so
exactly
the men who stare at goats kind of idea.
Yeah, that's Jean Barry's experiment. Oh, my timer is telling me. That was Jean Barry's experiment. He had this fungus, and he had people focus. Now, in another experiment, one, for instance, that was done using hemoglobin, some people, let me reframe it. An experiment involving hemoglobin samples, individuals who were asked to focus good intention produced a significant result, and people who were asked to produce a negative intention also produced a significant result. And that's why I think, I look at all of this research that I do, not only at the individual sort of laboratory level or even in the archaeological projects, multidisciplinary level, but I also look at it at the cultural level, because these things that we are studying, wait, okay, somebody got it. Anyway, these things that we study, those of us that are doing non-local consciousness research, have cultural manifestations. And we don't talk about that very much, or hardly at all, in fact. But in fact, if you look at the results of non-local consciousness research published in thousands of studies, what you see over and over again are little details which are reflected at a much larger level in the culture at large. As I said, why do religions all over the world, regardless of whatever their particular dogma is, teach meditation? And the answer is because it has been observed over thousands of years that when you meditate, you open to this other aspect of your consciousness, which is normally overwhelmed by the neuroanatomy and the sense impressions that are being produced. If you look at, for instance, the relationship between moments of genius by scientists or moments of transcendent experiences by spiritual pilgrims, or remote viewers who are describing teacups in a closet somewhere on the other side of the planet, what you see in their descriptions of what they're experiencing is the same thing. It's modulated by context. That is, scientists want to see insights into how the world works. That's what they experience. Spiritual pilgrims want to have a transcendental experience. That's what they experience. And the teacup describing remote viewers, that's what they're doing. So context and intention is what modulates the experience of non-local consciousness that you have.
Well, don't tell us your whole talk you're going to do tomorrow.
Oh, no,
we'll cover that. But there was a question related to the Matsumoto study that you talked about with water, where he was having people freeze water and then looking at their subjective response to the water and whether people thought it was better or whether they liked it more. And the same thing with the different characters that you were looking at. This type of thing I love, but it does seem to be open to criticism from skeptics who might say the subjective experience doesn't really carry the same weight as having something more quantifiable. Do you know of any studies that have done things more quantifiable?
Oh, yes. I just didn't have enough time. I have about 8 more experiments that I was going to go through, but I had 28 minutes, so that's what I did. Yes, there are a number of studies. Let me very quickly, I'll just give you some names. You can go do your own Google.
Well, if you can give us one that kind of.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll do better than that. I will send you the paper, and anybody who is interested can download the paper. Actually, it's already there. You can go. Well, no, it's already at academia.edu in ResearchGate, but I will send it to you, John. And you can send it out to anybody who's interested in the audience that's listening to this, because yes, there is a whole bunch more research. I just didn't have time to get to it, that make this clear that these kinds of changes that are witnessed and that are thought of, oh, well, you can't really evaluate that. But in fact, researchers have taken aspects of that and done very careful research and have given us objectively measurable outcomes that take it out of the, oh, well, that's just, who knows. As I said, I'm an experimentalist. I am a data person. I only care about data. And there is quite a lot of it. and it directly addresses a great deal about how our culture is formed.
So, Stephen, what I might recommend is if you have a bit of a bibliography or something that you wanted to share, you could post it in the forums, or if you felt like you wanted to send it to me, I could post it in the forums for people to access,
Well,
rather than people contacting me directly. It's a much easier since we already have this avenue to send it out.
let me send, because I don't know how to do that. And I'm not sure how to do it, and I don't want to screw things up. Let me send it to you, John. You put it up. I'm going to send you the paper that was the subject of this presentation, and you put it up. It's fully documented. It gives you all the citations. There's about 40 or 50 citations, and it'll give you lots of weeks of things to read.
Great. Send me the link and I can post the link and let people get to it.
Okay.
Our good friend Roger Nelson asked, can you use this to mitigate the effect of oligarchs?
Yes, absolutely, you can. I wrote a book called The 8 Laws of Change, which is exactly about that. We know from research done at Van Rensselaer Polytech, for instance, and by the way, I didn't have time to get to Roger's very important experiment just because, I just didn't have the time. But in any case, just to answer directly his question, we know that when 10% of any cohort, whether it's a school committee, a church group, a Boy Scout troop, or a nation, changes in consciousness, that the whole cohort of the nation, as an example, has to change to accommodate for it. And I will give you some very specific examples. You and I and Roger and many others who are watching this remember that when we were young people and you went over to somebody's house, there was an ashtray and a pack of cigarettes and one of those lighters your mother told you not to fool with on the coffee table in the living room. You don't see that anymore. Now, why is that? Did somebody pass a law saying it's illegal? Did the president get on television and tell everybody not to do that? No. What happened was scientists who did research on what tobacco did to people reported it, and enough people heard that they stopped smoking, and therefore the whole cohort changed. I'll give you another example. In fact, I'll give you two more examples. About 3 years ago, and you can check this doing a Google word search, where they keep track of how many times a particular word is searched. If you look back about 3 years ago, maybe 3.5 years now, gay changed to LGBT and then to LGBTQ. Now, again, did somebody in a public office stand up? Did they pass a law? Did the Congress make a pronouncement? No, none of that happened. What happened was a group of ordinary people were able to change their own consciousness. And when you got to 10% of them, then the whole culture began to accommodate for that. And I'll give you one more. And this is how Gandhi got independence for India without a war. They asked him just before he was assassinated in 1948. A reporter from the Times of India went up to see him at his ashram. So there he is sitting in his little dhoti with his little spinning wheel. And the reporter said, "My editor has only one question I'm supposed to ask you." And Gandhi said, "Well, what's the question?" And he said, my editor wants to know, how did you force the British to leave India and give it independence without a war? How were you able to do that? One of the most powerful nations on earth at that time. How did you get it to give up its most cherished colonial possession? And Gandhi's answer was, it's not what we did that mattered, although that mattered. It's not what we said that mattered, although it did matter. It was the nature of our character, our beingness, that led the British to choose to leave India. And so the answer to the question is, if we can get 10% of the population, or more, of course, to focus, for instance, on the preservation of democracy, it will survive. And if we don't, it may not. We almost lost it on the 6th of January.
Thank you, Stephen.